and it will make a huge difference whether a substantial part of that is spent in averting the climate crisis or fails to be spent in averting the climate crisis. We can do this recovery extremely well or extremely badly. And this discussion about the clean energy transition today will contribute to that debate about that historic opportunity and create both a sense of urgency and a sense of opportunity about how to rebuild better in the recovery process. Let me briefly introduce the wonderful panel we have before handing over to them. And just to note that after the speaker and panelists have spoken, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers. You will send them through the chat function. And that will probably be 25 or 30 minutes at the end. So please start thinking about your questions now and send them in through the chat. We have a keynote speaker. We're very honored to have Mechtild Verstöfer, who is the Director of Sustainability, Technology and Outlooks from the International Energy Agency. And she will tell us, of course, about the IEA's new World Energy Outlook, which you will have seen a great deal about in the media, because it's fairly revolutionary in a number of ways, and Mechtild will tell us about that. We have Javier Stein, who is the Managing Director of Meridian Economics from South Africa. From the World Bank, we have Chandra Govindarajulu, the lead energy specialist. From Canada, from Environment and Climate Change Canada, we have Stephen Kuhn, who is the Director General for Multilateral Affairs and Climate Change. From the Secretariat of the Clean Energy Ministerial, we have the head of the Secretariat, Dan Dorner. And as I mentioned, from the Climate Investment Funds, we have the CEO, Mafalda Duarte. Now, let me start by asking Mechtild to talk to us about the World Energy Outlook. Mechtild, please.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And I'm delighted to take part today in that, as you say, very timely debate on clean energy transitions, investment, and in particular, the impact of COVID and the outlook. So I will base my presentation on the World Energy Outlook findings, which we published a few weeks ago. We are also running a series of World Energy Outlook webinars this week, in fact. So every day from 2 to 3 Paris time, we have different topics which are open to all public, explained out of the World Energy Outlook. But let me start by looking a little bit how this COVID year, which is everywhere, how it impact the economic and the energy sector in particular. Next slide, please. So when we started our outlook this year, there were a couple of unknowns. One of them was the duration and the severity of the pandemic and the economic impacts, but also how would energy policymaker might respond. And as you can say that depending on one of these assumptions on these points, we can reach very different outcomes for the global energy economy. But let's go 1 year back. In 2019, our projections looked like that. Can you click? We had the WEO 2019 with an annual growth rate of 3.6 and the prevailing policy settings of the time that led to roughly 1% annual average growth in energy demand. But year by year, everything is different. Policies in some parts of the world have changed, but of course the main change is that COVID-19 has radically altered the starting point for our analysis. And that means the outlook for the global economy. Please click. So in our stated policy scenario, which is the baseline scenario of this year's WEO, we assume that the pandemic is gradually brought under control over the course of next year. And this allows for a steady recovery in global and economic activity. But are these assumptions too optimistic? As we may have seen already, and unfortunately it may become true, that this pandemic will stay with us longer, leaving deeper and longer lasting scares on social and economic life. And that's what we explore in our delayed recovery scenario. Please click. In this scenario, the near-term economic slump takes longer to shake off, another 2 years to get back to pre-crisis levels. But there's also significant damage to the long-term growth potential of the global economy. What does that mean for energy demand? In our stated policy scenario, we would come back to levels of 2019 in 2023. Please click twice. If we are in a delayed recovery, that means the pandemic will last longer and it will take 2 years more to come back, and that would be the lowest rate of global energy demand since the 1930s. Next slide, please. But there is the overall picture on energy demand, but there's a lot happening beneath these lines among the varied fuels and technologies that make up the energy sector. To start with, let's look at the updated assessment of the impact of the pandemic on energy in 2020. So energy demand is set to fall by 5% by the end of this year. This is the largest shock in 70 years since World War II. And as you can see, not all fuels are impacted the same way. What happens next? In our STEP scenario, that is where the pandemic is brought under control in 2021, oil demand gets back to pre-crisis levels within a few years, but there is no such rebound for coal. Jonathan mentioned the focus on coal. Coal is under pressure today from phase-out policies in many countries and regions. There is low natural gas prices, and the rise of renewables and the pandemic has worsened its outlook in many countries around the world. The main growth over the next 10 years come from natural gas, but even more from renewables. But what happens if the picture and if the recovery is delayed? Some investments in renewables are postponed because of the economic uncertainty. Weaker growth in electricity demand, but that area proves to be quite resilient. The larger impact are elsewhere. Almost all the growth in oil demand is whipped out, and coal and natural gas are much more affected by the weaker economic outlook. And that is the impacts of the delayed recovery scenario. I think you need to click through the slide, please. So if we go one more, please. That is the delayed recovery scenario. The reduction in emission in the event of this scenario comes with a huge economic and social cost. In practice, a weaker economy also drains momentum from the process of change in the energy sector. Let me go to the next slide. What does it mean for electricity? Electricity is growing. We are more and more electrifying all our sectors, and demand is expected to be strong among all our scenarios, while electricity production is witnessing a profound transformation. Please click. Over the past 2 decades, coal-fired power had its reign, increasing more than any other source. It was also the most often built technology in 12 out of the last 20 years. But solar PV is changing now the picture, adding the most capacity in each of the last 3 years. We are entering a new area, which our executive director called the new king of electricity, which is solar PV. Click, please. The solar PV under the steps, under the blue scenario here, expands well over 4,000 terawatt hours over the next 2 decades. The solar PV in that scenario becomes the primary means of meeting the growth in electricity demand growth, 1/3 of the total to 2030. Coal-fired generation declines globally, as you can see. It's not only about solar PV, there's obviously also growth, strong growth in wind, offshore and onshore wind. If we look at the Sustainable Development Scenario, which is the green one here in the slide, the potential for growth is even larger. And if you click a last time here, you can see the global solar PV market takes off, with solar becoming really the major source of electricity in the 10 years to come. One slide further, please. What about energy investments? The key to all the developments I just described lies in investment, the flow of capital to the energy sector, and that has also profoundly be affected by our today's crisis. I said before, energy demand is falling by 5% this year, but investments are hit much harder. We expect, and that is an updated figure, 18% less investments this year compared to end of 2019. Obviously, here again, there's a wide range of outcomes across different parts of the energy system. Investments in new oil and gas, as you can see, is hit hardest, with reductions of over 30%, while spending on renewables were much more resilient. I want to highlight here a couple of warnings when we go ahead. Clean energy investments, which includes also energy efficiency, has been flat in recent years at around $600 billion, and that's the same in 2020. So being resilient in the crisis is certainly not enough. We need to step up more than double over the next decade the investments in clean energy to be on track for a more sustainable energy future. And that is not enough. Not only we need to spend money on energy efficiency and renewables, but we also need to look at our grids. The grids are the backbone of a clean energy future. Investments in electricity networks has been declining for 4 years in a row now. If we are not careful, these networks will become a weak link in the transformation of the energy sector. Next slide, please. One more element which we need to watch in the way that the pandemic is really exacerbating the pre-crisis imbalances in the cost and available of capital. So the bulk of future investment needs are in emerging markets and developing economies. That's pretty much where the growth of the energy demand is. In countries like India, Brazil, Indonesia, South Africa, others. If we look at the major economies, they are set for an extended period of very low borrowing costs due to structural factors as well as our monetary policy. Can you click, please? Can you click twice, please? Thank you. Here you can see the difference. The same is not true. There's the major economies, the advanced economies, but there is also a pushing up of borrowing costs in some of our emerging economies. That is a significant risk to the energy outlook, especially because some of our clean energy technology are quite capital intensive. So in those countries, which you see here on the right, the changes in financing indicators observed in the first half year of this year would translate in a 10 to 25% increase in levelized generation costs, for example, for a new onshore wind farm investment, depending also on local conditions. Let me go to the next slide, please. This is important because of the need to shift the way that capital moves into the sector. These figures are only for investments in new energy supply infrastructure. And as you can see, 2020 has been a huge shock. Please click once. And then click another time. Whichever way things will now evolve, but particularly in our sustainable development scenario, which is Paris Agreement aligned, we would need to be mobilizing more capital into energy projects over the next decade. There is a significant shift towards investment in electricity generation and infrastructure compared with the amount dedicated to fuels, with almost all of that generation spending in all scenarios going to clean energy technologies. But there is also the need to be some change in fuel supply investments, and we need to look at low carbon fuels such as biogases, biofuels, and hydrogen. We hear a lot about hydrogen nowadays in many of our countries and regions. And in some, we also need to look in technologies such as carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Next slide, please. What are the implications of our scenarios for CO2 emissions and climate change? The CO2 emission in our baseline scenario rebound to 2019 level just before 2030. And that would remain relatively stable after that. That would not bring us in line with the Paris Agreement. Next click, please. If we go for our sustainable development scenario, where we have analyzed on a country level basis how energy system could transform over the next decades to meet targets on climate, air pollution, and energy access. To achieve that sustainable development scenario, the recovery from the pandemic needs to be as sustainable as possible. And there's a huge momentum right now when governments are planning and putting in place their sustainable recovery plans. We have launched with the IEA a sustainable recovery plan, which is part of that scenario where we look at job creation, growth, and what measures can bring down the emissions. If you click here now, we have looked at countries who have set up, and there are a number of them, pledges to reduce CO2 emissions to net zero by 2050 or some even earlier, and those who have introduced sustainable recovery packages. There's the European Union, UK, New Zealand, and many others. Another click, please. We have heard rather recently China announcement to reach net zero by 2060. This is very much welcomed and already achieved in that sustainable development scenario. And here, action over the next 5 years, as they are doing the next 5-year plan, is going to be essential. We already see early signs that emissions in China have already rebounded to pre-crisis level in April and being above those since. Another click. Even though we have now a number of countries, China, and also recent announcements by Japan and Korea, which are very encouraging, we all know that much more is needed. There has been an increasing interest on what it would mean for the energy sector to reach net zero emission, not by 2070, but already by 2050 globally. If you can click once. And this year's World Energy Outlook looks for the very first time to a net zero by 2050 globally case. And that would mean that we not only fulfill everything which is done in the sustainable development scenario on renewables, energy efficiency, all technology, we need another step and another involvement of everyone, governments, companies, investors, citizens, to step up even more rapidly. And that, I think, in a time where we are struggling with COVID and economic outlook, is absolutely crucial. The decisions we make now are having an impact to the next 3 years, to the next decade, and the long-term net zero plans. Next slide, please. We have looked in detail what it would take to bring the energy sector emissions to net zero by 2050, 40% down from today's level in the next 10 years first. So the short answer is that everyone needs to step up. If you can just click through it now. Companies and industries would need to develop and deploy low carbon technologies at scale. Indeed, a number of new industries will need to emerge, including in low carbon hydrogen. For example, the use of low-carbon hydrogen grows by nearly a factor of 100 over the next 10 years in that scenario. We need the citizens. There will be wide-ranging effects on the everyday life of a very large number of people. For example, every second car sold would need to be electric, bringing their sales from 2.5 to 50 million in a decade. And one more, we need the financial markets. There would need to be a step change in the pace and ambition to boost clean energy capital expenditure. For example, the level of investment in clean electricity technologies in the net zero case is around 4 times the largest level historically. Underpinning all of that is the critical role of governments. They can drive innovation and support development of new industries. They can help to realize the changes which we need to do in lifestyle choices and consumer purchases. We need to mobilize private finance, and we need to ensure cross-border and cross-sector collaboration. Next slide, please. Before closing, I will address one last issue, which is especially on coal-related emissions. There's a tendency in the climate discussion to focus on what we build or purchase from here on. But that's only part of the story. We also need to tackle the emissions from the equipment and infrastructure that we have already now. And this slide tries to explain why. Click, please. The industrial area has seen CO2 emissions steadily climb, building up a global energy system based on thousands of carbon-emitting power plants and factories, and millions of emitting buildings and vehicles. For example, at the start of 2020, over 2,000 gigawatt of coal-fired power plants without carbon capture were in operation, most of them in Asia. Click, please. And many of these will be also with us for decades. The average age of coal power plants in China is 12 years. And that we looked at all the CO2 emissions from infrastructure in place and nearing completion, plant by plant and region by region, and as I said, particularly in Asia and China. With the last plants finally retired only by 2070, we find that continuing to operate this infrastructure as we have done in the past would emit over 700 gigatons of CO2 over the next 50 years, leading to a global average temperature increase of 1.65. So there's a lot of risks in that lock-in emissions. My last point is some good news. There are basically four measures that can be taken to tackle these emissions. First, the repurpose. We can try to repurpose these coal power plants to focus on flexibility in combination with renewables. We can try to retrofit with carbon capture, or we can co-fire with biomass, and also, of course, retire earlier than the life expectation of these plants in some cases, but it cannot be done overnight. So my last message and conclusion here is we have a twin track approach. We need absolutely a faster deployment of clean energy technology, but also we need to look the operation of existing carbon intensive assets in a very different way. Thank you very much for your attention and looking very much forward to the discussions now.
Thank you very much, Mechthild. That was a wonderful overview of where we are and where we're going and the challenges that we face. And thank you for ending with some good news, because the challenges can get a bit overwhelming sometimes. Before I pass to the panelists, to our first panelist, Javier Stein, let me draw the attention of the audience to the chat box, what Abhishek has put in the chat box about how you can share information about this session on social media, about where the Climate Investment Fund's website is, and various other pieces of information. So if everybody could glance at that. And any questions that you have to put to the panelists at the end of the panelists' interventions, please address them to Abhishek in the chat box. So Mechtild, I was very struck by by all of your slides, in particular on the sort of positive side that solar PV is the new king of electricity. That's quite something for us to all hear and to hear from IEA. On the sort of worrisome side, the data that you have on developing countries, emerging markets and developing countries seeing the increasing borrowing cost, the increasing cost of capital, particularly when you emphasize how much capital needs to be invested going forward in clean energy. The increasing cost of that capital in countries that, in any case, in the recovery process, the economic recovery process, are going to be very concerned about growing debt distress, particularly sovereign debt distress, as part of their stimulus packages for recovery. It puts the spotlight really on funds like the climate investment funds, because they are obviously designed specifically to substantially reduce the cost of capital to developing countries. But they can do that to the extent that they have funds in their fund, to the extent that they are replenished for the purposes of boosting the recovery. And I think that will be a big debate. Let me pass now to Javier Stein, who is the Managing Director of Meridian Economics from South Africa. Javier, please.
Thank you, Jonathan. And thanks to Mechtild for her presentation, which I think sets a very good background for what I'm going to be talking about now. I'm going to be focusing on how we can accelerate coal transitions in emerging markets in particular. And of course, I'm coming with the perspectives and the lessons that we've learned from South Africa. Next slide, please. So I think the starting point for how we think about this is that it's important to understand the particular challenges, the particular nature of the problem that we have in these emerging market contexts. And in a nutshell, I think the key point is in emerging market power sectors that are fossil fuel intensive, they tend to be very path dependent or locked in trajectory. These markets tend to be highly concentrated and dominated by state-owned actors with many regulatory market access constraints and little competition. The incumbent utilities often face large financial challenges. They're often expected to provide electricity at sub-economic tariff levels. And as a result, they're not very financially viable and often have severe financing problems. These countries often have very high levels of poverty and income inequality, which creates a very particular political context within which this whole process plays out. And stakeholder groups are often dependent on fossil fuel-related value chains and are therefore politically influential. This often leads to resource curse type problems where elites are dependent on these coal or oil rents and will take action to protect these interests. Combined with these challenges, we often have a weak state. Decision makers often have limited appreciation of the extent and rapidly developing risks of the climate crisis. There's poor appreciation of the low-cost economics of renewable energy and of new technical paradigms for integrating high levels of variable generation into existing power systems. Also often, particularly in Africa, we find that there's an anti-market bias with decision makers, and there's distrust of a role for private sector participation in new market models that would be friendly for investment into renewable energy. Overall, there's limited capacity to implement large power sector regulatory and structural reforms. Typical examples of these kind of jurisdictions, of course, is South Africa, Mexico, Indonesia, etc. Next slide, please. Next slide, thank you. Yeah. So the implications of these circumstances is that in practice, the way policymakers in the global south perceive their challenges and objectives is often different to how leaders in the north perceive theirs. For us, this is an important point. One can't think about the challenges of accelerating decarbonization in the same way in these contexts as you would do in countries in the north. Priorities are often different here, and climate change is not necessarily at the top of the agenda. This means that the fact that the economic advantage, that renewables have an economic or cost advantage over fossil fuel power, even on a marginal cost basis, will not necessarily result in a faster transition. There are also key risks due to the greater role that state actors have in these sectors and the path dependence that we see. So for instance, as we've seen in Mexico and in South Africa, there's the risk of a political backlash and derailment of reforms when renewable energy rollouts start. There's also new risks of discovering new fossil fuel resources and the development of new fossil fuel industries with new vested interest groups. I'm thinking here particularly of natural gas in Mozambique and in South Africa as examples. So overall, what we learn from this is that we need to address the root causes of carbon-intensive path dependence in these sectors when we think about how to accelerate the transition. Next slide, please. So climate finance has, of course, been an important factor over the last decade or 15 years, and in particular, focusing on financing green infrastructure. But increasingly now, we know that that is valuable, but because of the technological development in renewable energy and often the very good natural resource endowment of wind and solar, it's not really necessary anymore because these investments are now economically and financially viable. On the other extreme, in the financial space, the divestment movement, of course, plays an important role. But in the emerging market context, on its own, it will not be sufficient to accelerate the transition, and it can actually cause severe economic hardship if it results in the failure of the large state public entities that operate in these sectors, and even backfire. So in the finance space, in the climate finance space, we also need a role for more constructive engagement with the incumbents. And this is where we start thinking about the role of transition finance. Next slide, please. So just to give you a very quick example, this is a scenario we've modeled about how one could accelerate the power sector transition in South Africa to moving from a very coal-intensive situation to having all coal off by 2040. And it's very obvious from this that even in this very ambitious scenario, we will still have to finance and operate a large amount of coal plant for the next 20 years to keep the lights on and keep the economy going. Next slide, please. So we need transition finance to help us unlock and accelerate the transition by supporting substantial measures to overcome economic, social, and political path dependence on the one hand, while also protecting the system integrity during the intervening period. So we've learned that these systems are very locked into the existing carbon-intensive development path, and that if one takes incremental steps to start increasing clean energy, you often just run into the positive feedback loops of this path-dependent system, and you encounter the pushback and the resistance that we've seen in some of these environments. So we need initiatives, including financing initiatives, that are much more ambitious and help us to build a bridge to establish new sustainable development paths. Next slide, please. So this is just an example again from South Africa, where we've modeled a number of increasingly ambitious transition scenarios for the power sector with the current status quo on the right-hand side of the slide. And what this is really telling us is it is possible to enormously accelerate our energy transition to clean energy and shut our coal plant earlier, and to do this at essentially zero cost, based on the very conservative assumptions that we used for for this modeling. This is a critical and very important picture because it tells us that in the post-COVID era, it's possible to trigger a large-scale self-sustaining self-financing accelerated renewables rollout. So the economics work to allow for a large green sustained stimulus. The only problem is we have to create the space and the policy commitment to allow this to happen. Next slide, please. So climate finance can be targeted at disrupting the positive feedback loops of carbon path dependence, and it's supporting attractive alternatives and sustainable development solutions. And as I said before, to help us build a bridge to new development paths where renewable energy achieves critical mass and establishes a new path dependence. The example that we've been working on in South Africa for such a transition climate finance option is one where the state power utility would offer a trajectory of accelerated decarbonization deliverables in return for highly concessional climate finance blended with green impact finance, which together will deliver a reasonable dollar per ton abated. It will include remedies to ensure performance for the concessionality offered, and the proceeds will be used to support just transition projects and also refinance the incumbent utility as it accelerates its coal shutdown program. So what this tells us is that large mitigation and important demonstration opportunities are available in emerging markets, and they offer exceptional good value for money. However, the traditional multi and bilateral DFI business models that one would expect that would support these opportunities are actually not well suited for this challenge. They often have very rigid rules and cannot engage in the kind of transition financing models that we envisage here. And frankly, they don't offer enough concessionality to help us overcome the kind of path-dependent lock-in challenges that we face. So therefore, in conclusion, we are of the view that sovereigns themselves and dedicated climate finance mechanisms are going to have to rise to the occasion and engage with these opportunities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fulvio. I think that was a very good explanation of the importance of transition finance, concessional transition finance to the decarbonisation transition process in South Africa. And frankly, an explanation that would apply in many developing countries, particularly large middle-income developing countries like South Africa. Let me pass now to Chandra Govindarajulu, lead energy specialist from the World Bank, to give us his remarks.
Thank you, John. At the outset, I'd like to thank CIF for putting this very interesting seminar and also inviting me. Also, thanks to Mitchell for a very nice presentation about the scenarios. These scenarios are very good guideposts at this point and highlight the uncertainties that come into play due to the COVID-19 pandemic at this point of time. So as we think about the energy transition in the current context, one thing that we also need to keep in mind is the SDG goals, especially also the IEA scenario shows that the impact on the vulnerable population is much greater than the impact on others. So, and we are at the risk of not being able to, maintain our access targets. And not only the new access targets, but also the poor that are connected are increasingly unable to pay. And if the situation continues, they will get disconnected. So we need to keep thinking about this. And also the impact is not only on the public access program, but it's also in the private sector. All of them are impacted. So the impact the focus now should be on economic recovery, including green growth, as everybody has said. And, but 2020 to 2030 should be the decade of action for energy transition as well as for energy access. So, we have had a great partnership with CIFs over the past 10 years. We've had some countries really stepping up their ambitions in clean energy. Morocco, South Africa, India, Turkey, Indonesia, Vietnam, all of them come to mind. So as we look to the next phase of, stepping up the, action on clean energy transition, we hope that these countries will continue to play a role as they are having increasing needs, demands for integrating variable renewable energy in the system from the perspective of from battery storage to EV charging to more digitalization, modernization of the grid networks. All that is much needed. On the access side, it is great that CIF has also now been open to a larger group of countries, and we have seen really good ambitions from countries like Burkina Faso, Tanzania, where CIF support was mobilized, and we'll hope to see more of these. So that is in terms of where we see the action on transition and access. In terms of the gaps, obviously, the drop in demand, it's the largest drop as Matt said in 70 years, is putting a strain on the suppliers. Utilities are facing unprecedented challenges with payment issues, low demand, and then obviously private sector is looking at them with as more risky, and the cost of capital is going up because the risk premium is higher. So that's where if we really need to focus on climate friendly recovery, the availability of concessional finance would be much needed. So again, we have witnessed on the off-grid sector even more so, providers, mini-grid and off-grid providers facing liquidity risks, and that needs to be supported. So we needed targeted support for energy access programs, and otherwise all the progress this industry has made, which is now a $1.5 billion industry, just the off-grid, will be lost with the efforts of all the agencies. So for the low-income customers, as we think of designing the programs, we also need to keep in mind the progress that has been made on energy price subsidy reform over the years, and ill-defined or ill-designed systems can, we don't want to lose on that ground also. And which would again be, will have negative impacts in meeting the SDGs in the longer term. So critical investments on grid infrastructure are needed to maintain as also previous speakers mentioned. So SMAP has been providing at the World Bank. SMAP has been providing a lot of upstream support to countries in achieving their SDG goals, and is well positioned to support these gaps as we move forward. So in terms of what the bank is doing, we are committed to supporting the countries build back better at a time when the COVID-19 economic recovery is being thought through, and it will also we need to we are providing support to policymakers to develop green stimulus interventions through an integrated approach that includes conventional financing upstream as well as downstream. That will help unlock private investments as well as public investments. So overall, I think we are now converging towards an approach that would have a more integrated approach, to reduce the cost of privately owned generation by reducing the risks, making the electricity more affordable, providing concessional financing to leveraging climate finance that should be available through CIF and other sources to unlock critical public investments that would be required to enable those private investments to come in. And also, most importantly, thinking about maximizing socioeconomic benefits for fostering jobs, for local communities, impact on local communities, as well as importantly on capacity building, and especially focusing on women's empowerment all this this could be done leveraging the clean energy transition process. So we are supporting a multi-stakeholder energy access relief fund to support the mini-grid and off-grid support suppliers also. We are working on the electrification of healthcare facilities, working with, for example, in Haiti, a combined project from SREP, which is a CIF instrument, as well as IDA. Will electrify prioritized, regional and district hospitals, as well as that lack reliable electricity, and reducing their reliance on diesel sources. I'll stop there for now. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Chandra. Let me just remind everybody about the chat box where you can send to Abhishek Bhaskar. You can send any questions that you have for the Q&A session towards the end. So I'd like to just draw everybody's attention to that. Let me briefly come back to our keynote speaker, Mechthild, and see if she has any reactions to anything that either Javier or Chandra said in their remarks. Mechthild.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you for the other two speakers. I would have one comment and another question, kind of. First, on energy access, I would fully agree that this is a very important issue, and we have in the SDG 7 achievements, we have in our sustainable development scenario, we not only achieve the Paris Agreement, but we assume also reducing air pollution and giving clean energy access to all by 2030. So this is included. But as we can see in COVID-19, we can see some very worrying trends also on energy access, in particular in Africa. In the last 6 years, energy access in Africa, in particular sub-Saharan Africa, went down. But in COVID year, we see again more people that having lack of access. So the positive trends over the last 6 years with COVID has also have a negative impact. And I think we need to highlight that also vis-a-vis our policymakers and investors and all that, because we could see that in a stimulus package post-COVID, in order to address this lack of access, universal access to cleaner energy, we would need 40 billion average annual investment throughout to 2030 to have that full universal access by 2030. And as I said, COVID 2020 is a bad year after some successful developments, in particularly in Africa. And my second point is related what also we just heard, about the differences in getting finance between the major developed countries and the developing countries. And we will look into more detail on, together with World Bank and others, on how to improve finance of clean energy transitions in these emerging markets. And we start the work now. It will be released in a few months. But this is an area, I think, as I said, and the other co-speakers, which is so important that we would like to look in more detail into it. Thank you very much, Jonathan.
Thank you, Mechthild. I think that last point is extremely important. I mean, given that clean energy is now cheap energy, but is nonetheless capital-intensive energy, there's a serious risk that developing countries in their recovery process from the global economic crisis, that developing countries remain locked into old, expensive, dirty energy, and that therefore become less globally competitive economically as a result, compared to countries that are able to invest in the new, cheap, clean energy. That's a big difference from the situation we saw after the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, when the clean stuff was still expensive stuff. Now, the clean stuff being the cheaper stuff, it has huge competitive competitiveness implications if the financing is not forthcoming on a sufficient basis for the developing countries. Let me pass now to Stephen Kuhn from Environment and Climate Change Canada. Stephen, please go ahead.
Thank you, Jonathan, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. As Jonathan has introduced, my name is Stephen Kuhn. I'm the Director General of Multilateral Affairs at Environment and Climate Change in Canada. Just to briefly introduce myself in that role, I serve as Canada's Deputy Chief Negotiator for Climate Change in the UNFCCC process and all that that entails, from Paris Agreement negotiation and implementation, as well as climate finance, and our Minister of Environment's engagement at G20, G7, and other multilateral fora such as those. And I should say that I'm delighted to have this opportunity to speak at the Climate Investment Fund conference today and to be presenting alongside such an impressive panel. I've learned a lot already today, and I know that we're only half done. Let me also begin by thanking Mafalda and her team at the CIFs for organizing such an important series. It's a very timely conversation for us, so thank you very much for that. Let me start by stating the obvious, which has already been said. The climate crisis has been advancing on us long before the COVID-19 pandemic, and the world is increasingly experiencing its effects. That's why we're here today. And as we've heard clearly, and I just want to emphasize, we must also use the coming investment in economic recovery that will follow the pandemic as an opportunity to pursue a science-based transition to low-carbon energy future consistent with the Paris Agreement. So as part of this work, coal remains a key area of focus for us as it continues to be the largest contributor to the growth of GHG emissions and the single largest source of global temperature increase. Mathilde has set the stage very nicely for us today with the most recent data. She's shown us that coal is under pressure, but that much more is needed. To meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, the latest data that we have is that the shift to clean power needs to progress 4 times faster than the current pace. That means retiring one or converting one coal plant every day from now until 2040. COVID-19 has demonstrated a decline in the primary demand for coal. We've seen that data this morning. Yet more than 500 gigawatts of new coal power is proposed or under construction globally. We in Canada, we remain committed to phasing out coal, both within our domestic market and internationally. And we're proud of our leadership with the UK in the Powering Past Coal Alliance. And I just want to take a moment to talk about that alliance. Since its launch by our 2 governments, Canada and the United Kingdom at COP23 in 2017, the PPCA has been increasing its reach and influence and is working to advance the transition from unabated coal power generation to clean energy. And just over the past 3 years, more than 110 national, regional, local governments, as well as well-known businesses and financial institutions have joined the alliance. So the momentum is building for global phase-out efforts. And through the alliance, we're trying to do so in a comprehensive manner with a strategy that focuses on 3 sides of the energy equation: on suppliers of coal-fired power plant equipment, on purchasers and users of coal plants, as well as institutions that finance these transactions. This alliance will continue to deepen its efforts to expedite coal phase-out internationally. But of course, there's more that's needed beyond its scope to facilitate the global transition to clean, affordable, and secure energy needed to meet the Paris goals and lift millions out of poverty. So on that note, let me just switch to climate finance, which has already been raised this morning for a moment. Along with mitigation and adaptation efforts, climate finance is a core commitment within the Paris Agreement and is therefore very central to what we need to do. As part of our own clean energy transition efforts, Canada is leveraging climate finance to increase universal access to reliable, affordable, clean energy sources and to facilitate the adoption of clean energy solutions. In November 2015, Canada announced $2.65 billion to support developing countries to take ambitious climate action. And this funding has helped developing countries, in particular the poorest and the most vulnerable, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and encourage this transition to low carbon, sustainable, and resilient economy. We're providing this support through 3 key channels: single donor blended finance, multilateral funding, and bilateral and regional support. So let me just very briefly talk about each one of those in turn. The first, Canada has focused a significant amount of its resources on single donor blended finance facilities, which has generally meant partnering with multilateral development banks to catalyze private sector investment in climate action. Using concessional financing, these facilities enable private investment that would not otherwise have happened because of various market barriers. Just one of these, as an example, is the Canadian Climate Fund for the private sector in Asia, in partnership with the Asian Development Bank. And through that fund, we're supporting the construction and operation of a wind power project and 4 solar power projects in remote areas of eastern Indonesia, which is the first utility scale solar project development by the private sector in that country. The second, Canada's multilateral funding, includes, as an example, $275 million to the World Bank to assist developing countries, particularly those in Southeast Asia, to phase out their dependence on traditional coal-fired electricity generation while supporting energy efficient and renewable energy alternatives to power their fast-growing economies. So through that program, we're mobilizing private sector capital. We're also providing training and employment opportunities for women in particular in clean energy sectors. And finally, of the 3, is bilateral or regional cooperation. And Canada supports the implementation of developing countries' NDCs, including support that focuses on deploying clean and renewable energy to shift countries away from their reliance on carbon-intensive sources to meet their energy needs. So, where do we go from here? Despite all that we're doing, we recognize that there's much more that needs to be done to align climate finance with coal phase out internationally. We've heard some speakers already this morning talk about some of the challenges in how climate finance has been rolled out to date. We know that barriers to energy transition are not just technical and they're not just financial. There's more to be done to facilitate the global policy, economic, and social shifts that are needed to enable an inclusive and a just transition. Dr. Stein spoke very clearly about the political and social challenges associated with this transition, and I just want to emphasize that as well. We support coordinating efforts around existing or proposed platforms rather than creating something new or diffusing effort across a number of different programs and donor countries. In addition, grants provided to international organizations with energy expertise can be used in tandem with climate finance loans to strengthen the clean energy business case in developing countries by de-risking technical and regulatory concerns. This can in turn crowd in further private sector investment. It can also provide the opportunity to create an ongoing dialogue between international organizations, MDBs, recipient countries, and the private sector on how to continue to catalyze long-term investment in clean energy. Just to shift gears for a moment, the UK presidency has identified clean energy transition as being a key priority for next year's COP26, leveraging the Powering Past Coal Alliance that I've spoke about, as well as a new Energy Transition Council as complementary platforms to build upon momentum for coal phase out. And I'll end with this thought. As donor countries, as donor governments, we need to be part of the solution. That is clear. But we are only part of the solution. And I'm encouraged by the momentum and the progress seen this year through the PPCA and on the road to COP26. But to succeed, we all need concerted efforts across sectors, industries, and jurisdictions, including donor countries, coal transition economies, MDBs, private sector, philanthropies, labor and civil society, and many, many more. And it's dialogues like this one and the leadership shown by the CIFs and others present today that will help bring us together to make this a reality. So thanks once again for inviting me to be part of this discussion today.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I think it's interesting and very helpful to hear Canada's perspective as a donor country. I mean, perspective on the programs that you've funded, the programs you've implemented, and particularly your last point about the role of donor governments vis-a-vis all the other stakeholders, the developing countries, the MDBs, and so on. It's very important to put things in that context. Let me now turn to Dan Dorner from the Clean Energy Ministerial, the head of Secretariat of the Clean Energy Ministerial. Dan, please.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jonathan. Hello there, everyone. Great pleasure to be here with you today. Let me just give a few perspectives from the CEM. So the Clean Energy Ministerial, the CEM, obviously we bring together a community of the world's largest and leading countries, but also companies and international experts to achieve that single mission of accelerating clean energy transitions, a topic of discussion today. Our members account for 90% of the world's installed clean power generation capacity, 80% of global clean energy investments, and the vast majority of public R&D in clean energy technologies. But in addition, and it's an important addition, the majority of our members have stated their intention in one way, shape, or form to achieve net zero. And also, in addition to that, our community and our coalitions extend beyond our membership, and that's something that we welcome and we encourage in our ongoing work programme. So in short, we're seeking to provide a platform for the global clean energy community to come together to build goal-orientated action coalitions that accelerate that clean energy transition. So where do we stand in terms of the clean energy transitions today? Well, if Mechthild will forgive me, I will also just quote the IEA here for a couple of minutes. So the IEA's Tracking Clean Energy Progress Report, which was actually originally envisaged in many ways to be a scorecard for the success, if you like, of the CEM, still tells a somewhat sobering story. So looking across the 46 critical clean energy technologies judged in terms of their progress, very few of them are judged to be on track under its traffic light system. A few are green, many are amber, and there are actually more red than there are green, which are often described by the IEA as being woefully off track. Fortunately, and somewhat more encouragingly, looking forward, the IEA again tells us that under a net zero scenario, 3/4 of the emissions reductions that we need over the next half century come from solutions that are already known today and are already in some stage of market deployment. And actually, if we look over the next decade, which many have already said is a critical decade, and I agree, that number raises to nearly 95%. So as Mechthild has said, the next decade requires unprecedented change, but it's often in the case of broadening and deepening the deployment of things that have already been done, financing projects that have already been done and priced somewhere else and proven somewhere else. But that does mean that this clean energy decade must be, first and foremost, a decade of deployment. Across sectors, across technologies, we must move rapidly from early adoption to mass market, and from mass market to massive market as quickly as we possibly can. So these findings are a bit sobering, but it's also important to help us gauge where we are, what more we need to do, and as I say, that many of the solutions are actually already known to us. We're also seeing, as being mentioned already today, that many of the clean energy solutions are increasingly the most competitive solutions. And related to this, a greater acceptance that clean energy investment is a driver of jobs and growth. So a clean recovery is an economic opportunity, not just an economic cost. We're also seeing, pleasingly, several new and positive policy announcements over recent weeks and months. And for those that have them, they'll certainly attest that net zero commitments focus the minds of policymakers, of companies, of all decision makers. And I think also there's just a broad acceptance that the next year, 2021, is going to be, and absolutely needs to be, a big year for climate and clean energy action. There'll be numerous important stepping stones, including our own next Clean Energy Ministerial meeting, I'm sure the IEA's Clean Energy Transition Summit, the UK's G7 presidency, Italy's G20 presidency, all being important in their own right, but also feeling like important stepping stones towards COP26 at the end of next year. And in terms of COP26, we're certainly pleased that the Clean Energy Ministerial's work programme is very well aligned with the UK's own energy transition campaign in terms of clean power, efficiency, clean transport, etc. And we're pleased to be engaging across all of those fronts. We're also honoured to be engaged with the UK's Energy Transition Council, being led by the COP26 president. We think that provides an important and timely opportunity to bring actors together to try and help countries move from coal to clean in the power sector as quickly as possible, and obviously very aligned with the focus of this session and the engagement of a lot of the stakeholders here with us today. So overall, there are kind of reasons for pessimism, there are reasons for optimism, but there's certainly every reason to take action. So many signals already all point to one thing, which is really the feeling that the time is now. And I have to say, in terms of our own community, this was very much echoed in our recent ministerial meeting, where we had the strongest ministerial and company engagement ever. And across that whole community, I think there really was a sense of determination, commitment, resilience, and momentum. And that really flowed through the whole meeting. The theme of supporting the recovery and shaping the future really was one that everyone ascribed to. And its unofficial mantra was very much bring actions, not words. And I can say it was action-packed. And just to mention a few examples, it demonstrates that, you know, the launch of our Drive to Zero campaign by China and Canada in the lead, aiming to enable the greater deployment of zero emission and near zero emission commercial, medium and heavy duty vehicles globally, recognizing the importance of that challenge going forward. The BioFuture platform coming into the clean energy ministerial community as its newest initiative to advance low carbon bioeconomy that is sustainable, innovative and scalable. And also to see that in other areas as well. So we could see new members and growing coalitions across hydrogen, electric vehicles, power sector integration and flexibility, for example, really demonstrating the importance that our community sees in those topics going forward and the need for them to engage multilaterally. The Clean Energy Education and Empowerment Initiative, which we lead jointly with the IEA, was able to showcase its new International Ambassador Program, which has been tasked with increasing the efforts of individuals and companies to advance gender diversity in the energy sector. Another important priority for us going forward. But also we saw new analysis, new reports on things like, for example, key financing principles for CCUS, an important topic for many people listening today. Also on how to integrate electric vehicles into the power system, something that's increasingly going up the agenda in a number of countries as they're seeing, as Mechtil talked about, the explosion in the demand for electric vehicles that is expected in the years ahead. And also we saw when we had our community asking us what they thought some of the priorities for us should be going forward, there was very clearly a demand and a coalition growing around the need for more work on efficient and clean energy in industry. Also as well, how to really leverage the opportunities of the clean recovery and to make sure that there is coordination and cooperation across countries and companies in that space. And importantly, as been touched on by some of the other speakers, a greater focus on the socio-economic aspects of the energy transition and making sure that they're not missed. Overall, from our ministerial meeting, I'd certainly highlight that this was not a meeting mired in fatalism. It was one seeing the need and the opportunity to accelerate action and embrace that. A recognition also that the transition will increasingly move from being a largely power sector focus, although the power sector will remain crucial, to a whole economy focus, from a solely energy ministry focus to an every ministry focus, and a shift from governments and companies to the greater inclusion of communities and citizens. All in all, a strong reaffirmation of the need and mutual gain from international clean energy collaboration. And that really spoke very much to our mission here in the Clean Energy Ministerial, but also to a lot of people speaking today around the value of clean energy conversations in terms of learning from each other and learning how to do it better. Clean energy coordination, especially when so many of the cost reductions will come from scale economies, means that coordinating across markets can really help leverage the benefits of those scale economies. And clean energy collaboration, the need in many places, especially those really large capital investments or very long international supply chains, to do it together if we actually want to make sure that it works successfully, potentially in areas like clean hydrogen. So I think there's just a few thoughts from the perspective of the Clean Energy Ministerial on the topic of today, and I'll pass it back to you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Dan. That was inspiring. I think we're all going to remember the time is now and bring action, not words, and the importance of, what was your phrase, moving from mass market to massive market, and the importance of scale and doing it together. I think those are emerging themes for the global recovery that we're going to be discussing a great deal in the months to come, and hopefully see a great deal of action, not just discussion. Let me now pass to Mafalda as the CEO of the Climate Investment Funds to make her remarks. Mafalda.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you to all the panelists as well. This is an excellent panel, and thank you for all of the participants that are here today in our event. And we are certain that a lot more will be seeing this afterwards through the recording that is being done. I think, all of the key points, this was a very rich, we had a very rich set of presentations and points being made. Let me share a little bit my own viewpoint on a number of these areas. The way I like to look at this at the time we are living right now is by actually starting off and comparing with the 2008 global crisis as well. And there's a couple of numbers that I always like to retain in my mind in relative terms to what we are facing right now. So when we look, some of the key statistics from an emerging markets and developing countries point of view are the following. By the end of 2010, developing economies had lost an estimated $2.6 trillion in output. There had been a real GDP decline by more than 2% in 2008 and in 2009. And when we look, for example, at a continent like Africa, the per capita income drop of 20% for the poorest 390 million people in that continent. These are already pretty concerning, significant numbers. But we all know that what we are facing right now is much more severe than this. Even more recently at the World Bank IMF annual meetings, the forecasts, the realized impact already and the forecasts were much worse than this. The World Bank itself has estimated that when we compare with the pre-crisis forecasts, COVID-19 can actually push an additional 100 million people into extreme poverty this year alone. So this is an important way to look at what we are facing right now. The other key important point is climate change. If we think that what we are facing right now is very severe, we have to look carefully at the forecasts of what the climate change impacts might be all across all sectors, and therefore really understand the need for these transitions that we are talking about in the energy sector and others, and accelerate the pace at which we are supporting these transitions. Mathilde made an important point, which I think is very critical to retain. And I say it often in the discussions with a number of stakeholders. Seeing leadership in developed countries is critical. And the very positive commitment in Europe and now more recently by a number of countries as well to net zero. But Mathilde, one of her slides also showed very clearly, despite all of these commitments from key economic blocks, the climate change challenge will be resolved in developing countries if we are to tackle it. Why? Because according to OECD itself, we will be investing in infrastructure around $19 trillion in the next decade. 2/3 of these investments will be done in emerging economies. If we don't ensure that these investments align with our climate goals, with low carbon and resilient infrastructure, then we are locking ourselves into scenarios that we certainly don't want from a climate perspective. I think Mehtil also mentioned, let's just look at an example, India. India's per capita electricity consumption is likely to double in just 1 decade. And we know what this means because of the size of India's economy and its population. So we have this coming together of the realization that we have very much to do if we are to tackle the climate challenge, and we are at the same time going through a very deep, serious economic and social crisis right now, which is still uncertain the magnitude of its impact. And a lot of people say this, and I think it is very much in point that this is an historical opportunity because of fiscal stimulus packages that we are seeing and that countries will be committing to, and the investments that will be made to support this recovery. This is the moment to make sure that the investment decisions are aligned with the climate goals. And the good news is that this alignment brings about jobs and can bring more jobs than alternative investment options. So let me also refer to this, and IA and Irina talked to this in multiple forums. I've heard them speak about this. But let me quote here a 2011 World Bank study where they indicated that $1 million invested in oil and gas in the United States, for example, creates 5 jobs. This is compared with 17 jobs per $1 million invested in energy-saving building retrofits, 22 jobs for mass transit, and 13 and 14 jobs per $1 million invested in wind and solar sectors. So clearly, this is just one example. One can look at other countries and it's the same thing. And in fact, all of the experts and specialists in the aftermath of this COVID said, clean energy investments, energy efficiency, nature conservation, sustainability of transport, these are the win-win areas for stimulus investments. Now let's look more carefully at the energy transition. I was actually very pleased to hear Mehtil say something that we've also came to that conclusion more than a year ago, and therefore, the reason why we established a dedicated investment program for renewable energy integration. Because we have, over the past 12 years ourselves, with our colleagues and implementing partners in multilateral development banks, focused quite a bit on support to renewable energy power generation. But it is very clear that as that capacity increases, it's become very clear that the power systems aren't prepared to integrate this intermittent renewable energy at the scale that we need to see happen. So it is this focus now of ours and of our partners on renewable energy integration investments, including storage. We believe it's going to be really, really important. We need to make sure that these energy distribution systems are flexible, that they are capable of handling this influx of variable renewable energy sources, but they are also robust enough to deal with the demand shocks like what we see right now with COVID-19. So we are very pleased to see that our global energy storage program we already started. We launched it last year. In our renewable energy integration program, was endorsed by our board in the end of the first quarter of this year, and we very much hope to be able to start the implementation of this investment program in next year, early next year. So that's clearly one area of focus for us. The other one is more directly speaking to the topic of this webinar, coal. And somebody also said, I think it was also Mechtil, that in the climate finance community, the focus has been quite a bit on the support to renewable energy power generation, in driving these new technologies, deeper penetration of these new technologies, learning curves going up, cost curves coming down, and then that's great. And that's also why IEA is now saying solar is the king, or your CEO says solar is the king. So that support over the past 10, 12 years was very much important for us to see the transition that we've already seen and the economics playing out the way we have. But it's not enough. So focusing only on renewable energy, new renewable energy power generation is not going to be enough. So we really need to focus on how do we accelerate the transition in the coal sector. So this is an area that we've decided that we were also going to be focusing quite a bit on, and putting forward an investment program proposal that would be like we have done before with our investments, providing demonstration to countries and globally to all of the key stakeholders on how one can support such transition in coal regions, and do it in a way that it's an integrated, holistic way. Grove also spoke of this political dimension and social dimensions of the coal transition. And these are critical. We can't just think about the assets. We can't just think about the power plants or the land associated with the coal mines and these coal assets. We have to think about the communities. We have to think about the social dimension, the people and communities dimension. And we also have to think about the government, different levels of government dimensions as well. So I think our speakers today spoke quite clearly as to the economics and what we are seeing as well, that the economic viability of these coal assets is declining rapidly, and we will see this continuing in the future. However, it is still, and there was also an interesting study not that long ago from Rocky Mountain Institute with other stakeholders that looked at this transition and the costs associated with this transition in developed countries and developing countries. And what they have found is that currently, for key developed countries actually that they analyzed, transitioning away from coal and divesting from coal would actually bring about net savings. But that's not the case in developing countries. In developing countries, it would still bring about net costs. And therefore, because of the need to accelerate that transition also in developing countries, because of the fact that there are still, on aggregate, economy-wide, net costs associated with this divestment, because we need to look at, as I was stating, this coal transition beyond what's happening exclusively at the level of the assets, but what is surrounding the socioeconomic development of those regions. Support to developing countries, meaningful support to developing countries at this point in time, we believe is going to be extremely critical. Mechtil also spoke about something which is very important to bear in mind, which is cost of capital. While we see in developed countries cost of capital going down for these investments in developing countries, we see going up. And also a point where the debt burden is quite significant. So really the word here is ambition, is seizing the moment, is ambition, is accelerating, is action, as Dan was also saying. And we are very happy to be offering our platform to our different stakeholders, the multilateral development banks, to the countries, to the contributor countries, to the donors, to other private sector, civil society, making our platform available through our investment programs. And we are expecting that our coal transition investment program will be approved at our board meetings this week, offering this as a contribution to focus on areas that really need a focus on and need this investment at scale by bringing all of the key partners together. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Mafalda. That was a very good account of what the CIFs have been doing and are planning to do, and particularly including the coal transition program that's being considered by the board this week, a very important program. We've sort of run out of time. I wouldn't dare to summarize a very rich discussion, except to say that we had some recurrent themes about the sense of urgency at this moment in time in the climate change global dynamic and in the global economic recovery, and how those two things are very much converging. It was extremely interesting to hear from Dan from the Clean Energy Ministerial about how those themes are on everybody's lips, and to hear about how that goes actually beyond ministries of energy to to a whole of government approach, which of course is absolutely fundamental to what was the phrase? Bringing actions, not just words. Let me thank all our panelists, our keynote speaker and our panelists for stimulating a great discussion, a great set of interventions. Apologies to those who sent in excellent questions that we won't be able to address, but there was a great deal of interest from the audience that actually posed some very difficult, very important and very difficult. Let me close out at this point. Thank you to everybody for their participation. Thank you.
Thank you.